Hey everybody. Today I want to talk about elemental weaknesses, one of the new proposed changes to old school RuneScape with Project Rebalance. Now, if you haven't read the blog, I would probably encourage you to start with that first, as I don't want to cover all the steps. Instead, I'd like to give my own opinion on it and why I am not particularly positive about these changes, and why, if it was pulled, I would probably be voting against it. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the discussion around this topic has been a little bit hostile. I know a lot of people are really excited about this and they want to see these changes, and I think a lot of critique is often shut down as fear-mongering or, nostalgia. You don't want any updates to the game. You're worried about the evolution of combat coming back, and don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are plenty of those. But there are legitimate problems as well that I think should probably be heard and addressed. Otherwise, if it does get pulled and just shut down, I think at the very least you should understand why people are doing that. I'm not saying I have the right answer, or I'm not saying that you're wrong for having a different opinion. I just want to offer my perspective and open up the floor for a bit more discussion. As always, if you disagree, feel free to leave a comment. Just keep it civil, please. To start off, I did mention evolution of combat, which I know for many people is like big red flags. It was what turned them off from RuneScape 3. I just want to say that I played RuneScape when the evolution of combat came out, and I also played RuneScape 3 about 2 years ago. I took a break from old school, and I actually enjoyed the evolution of combat, surprisingly. So I hope you can take my word for it that I am not here just to fearmonger about the evolution of combat. I'm not saying it should be added to old school. I treat them as kind of two separate games, but that's not my worry here. In fact, I think the comparison isn't really apt to begin with. In RuneScape 3, while weaknesses are a part of the evolution of combat, they focused a lot more on the combat triangle. So mage being weak to ranged, and mage being strong against melee. So a magic monster would be weak to ranged, and within that you would also have additional bonuses to the specific types. For example, thrown, crossbows, or bows. Kind of like what we're getting with the new ranged updates. Unfortunately, I think the system proposed to old school RuneScape is taking the worst aspect of this weakness system, and that's the elemental weaknesses. Also, this is probably the last time I'll talk about RuneScape 3. Don't worry, it's not going to be a lecture. I've come up with 6 points that I think are the primary reasons for introducing this system, elemental weaknesses, and I'll be explaining my reasoning why I am not particularly sold by these ideas and I don't think they'll be entirely successful. 1. To encourage using the standard spellbook, to give purpose to other spells besides fire in the same tier, to include logical and intuitive weaknesses, to make magic more appealing for early Slayer and combat, to encourage bringing specialized weapons and styles, and to open up reward spaces. Those last two are pretty much explicitly stated, so I think it's fair. This video might go kind of long, so timestamps will be in the description if you'd like to break it down into chunks. Let's start with that first one. Encourage using the standard spellbook. Now, don't get me wrong, this will certainly encourage more people to use the standard spellbook, and especially some of the spells that don't get used, such as Earth Surge. It's not really a surprise here when you're buffing the damage of it by something like 70%. If you had access to the Harmonious Staff, you probably also have access to, a Dragon Hunter Lance, which is more DPS. So I don't think this will entirely replace the best in slot methods. However, there's certainly alternatives now if you enjoy training a different style. However, how this is done is not that interesting to me. You see, the Adamant Dragon is getting this massive DPS increase because of its 50% Earth weakness. A 50% weakness translates to a 50% accuracy bonus and a 50% damage bonus. So sure, people will be using the standard spellbook and some of the lesser used spells now, but I think this would be true of almost any item in the game given such a massive damage bonus. I think you can almost imagine what it would be like if there was a boss that was weak to two-handed weapons. The Soul Reaper Axe would absolutely be better. This kind of leads me to wonder, why not simply buff the standard spellbook to begin with? Why not just give it more damage so that it is more useful around the board? As it stands, I think you're still going to be using powered staffs most of the time, and then the few cases where mobs just have this massive weakness to standard spells, you'll be using that instead. It feels like the standard spellbook still kind of sucks, except the few instances where it is just incredibly powerful. Maybe that's good though, and that's okay. You have a little bit of variety. My question here though is this even really necessary to begin with? The standard spellbook is a basic beginner spellbook. It's the first one you're introduced to with no requirements. It's easy to understand, it has useful teleports, and a very simple progression of all the spells. Even in the mid to late game, it still holds relevance. It's not like you stop using this spellbook. Sure, you might not use all the combat spells, but if you don't have house teleport tablets, you'll still want to teleport to your house. And High Alch is still a great spell that you're definitely going to want to bring along to many Slayer tasks. That's something that you're giving up by swapping to the other spellbooks. Most importantly, I think the other 3 spellbooks should be more useful useful in the mid to late game. There are things that you unlock and kind of progress into, and then you have to make a choice between those as to how you want to use them. If that's not good enough for you and you think that the standard spellbook should still be relevant across the entire game, I don't know if it's just the standard spellbook that kind of has this problem of being fairly useless. Maybe this is okay with the lunar spellbook. It doesn't really have that many options for combat as it's primarily focused on skilling, but even the Arceus spellbook is hardly ever used for just about anything except thralls. Sure, there's a couple of niche cases. Sometimes you'll be using vengeance, but overall, most people are not using these other spellbooks for combat. Even the ancient spellbook is mostly used in cases where you need AoE damage or a freeze. I mean, seriously, when's the last time you cast Smoke Blitz or something like that? People aren't using these in single target encounters ever. So really, I think the problem here has less to do with the standard spellbook and more to do with all of the combat spellbooks. They're just not that useful as spells. And powered staffs are just so much stronger than them that I don't think that buffing the standard spellbook by 50% is necessarily fixing the problem. It's just making the standard spellbook a bit more useful, but your regular spells are still kind of weak. I think elemental weaknesses could just as easily be weakness to grass spells or weakness to shadow spells. Really, it's the same thing. And I don't think just selecting a couple mobs and saying, hey, you in particular get slammed by standard spells is really a great fix here. Now, maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe there's more to the standard spellbook. After all, it has the most amount of spells. So let's talk about point 2. Giving purpose to other spells besides just fire in the same tier. As it stands right now, once you've gotten the fire spell, you really have no reason to use any of the others, and I think that that's a fair criticism. Unfortunately, I don't think that this is really achieved with the current method of introducing elemental weaknesses. And the elemental weaknesses are really just a disguised way to give certain monsters a bonus damage from using the standard spellbook without just flat out buffing the standard spellbook across the whole board, which I think would go pretty negatively, or creating certain monsters that are just weak to standard spells. It's kind of like a flavor way of introducing the same concept without making it feel as bland. To be clear, flavor is fine and there's nothing wrong with that, but I don't think that that's actually giving purpose. Fire spells are used because they deal the most damage. That's pretty obvious. However, that's the reward for progressing your magic level. If you don't have the magic level to cast the fire spell, you have to use one of the lower damage alternates. I think a lot of people don't ever feel this because progression is pretty fast in the early game, and by the time you're towards the mid to late game, you've already stopped using the standard spellbook, and instead, you're using ancients or powered staffs like the trident. In addition, the damage is fairly incremental, so it doesn't feel like these massive milestones as much. Instead, it's just get the level for the fire spell, and then you're always using the fire spell. I don't necessarily see the argument, though, that every one of the other spells has to be useful. It's a weaker spell with a lower level requirement. Just as I don't think Chivalry has to have a niche over Piety. It's a weaker version of the same prayer. The issue here is that with the change, every single spell essentially functions as the same thing. We don't really have Fire Strike or Fire Bolts or Fire Blast anymore. It's all just one generic strike. Once you've hit Magic Level 13, all of your strikes do 8 damage. And really the only difference is the runes that you use, which is fairly trivial, and a tiny amount of experience, which I think will still make Fire Strike the best. You're getting more experience for using it. So we haven't really created a reason to use Earth Strike or Water Strike. It's just Fire Strike with 4 different colors. You have red Water Strike and green Water Strike. The only reason why you are using that is because the game is telling you that this one is weak to blue Fire Strike or this one is weak to green Fire Strike. Sure, this increases variety. You are casting different spells, but again, it's the same spell in just a different color. The damage is identical. It's just you have to select a different color. I think you can almost imagine a scenario where instead of having a fire weakness or a water weakness, they just assigned elemental weakness to some monsters and you could cast whatever elemental spell you wanted for 50% more damage. And the color is completely your choice, so just pick whatever you like, I guess. Giving purpose to the other spells would require actually making them do something different, kind of like how Ancient Magix tries at this. And while I don't think it was entirely successful, this is still creating a different, use case for the different spells. Ice spells are still by far the strongest because they do the most amount of damage, but the lifesteal effect of Blood Barrage does give it a couple of uses. I think Shadow is the closest example here, where for some monsters like Leviathan or the Abyssal Sire, it just does an extra effect, it stuns them, and it's completely arbitrary. Again, it's just artificially creating a use for that specific spell. And even the items that kind of try to lean into this special effect are not particularly useful. So I'm a little hesitant to be super excited about just scrapping this idea and instead just running with different colors do more damage based on whatever monster is weak to. I think that this system is at least a little bit more interesting, and I would rather see them spend more effort on refining this part of Magic as opposed to more spells that are just different colors. If they really wanted to give them a purpose, I think they would have to do something similar and give them a unique effect. Air spells could attack one tick faster, so this would be really good for low health mobs. Water spells could have very high accuracy. Perhaps ordinarily a monster that you wouldn't be doing with Magic suddenly becomes a little bit more viable with water spells. Earth spells could deal the most damage, and fire spells could maybe apply a small burn. Even if these were fairly cosmetic changes, like Earth hitting twice, but the damage was actually the same, I think even that would be more interesting to me, because as it stands right now, the proposals just change them to cosmetic variants of each other anyways. Now, even if we did add changes to all the spells, there would be like a best spell for every single monster. However, that answer would come organically through, DPS calculations based on your gear, or with just kind of guessing at it based on what you're fighting, as opposed to where it is right now, where you're basically just given a spreadsheet of this is the correct spell to use for this monster. Maybe that is the appeal though, different spells for different monsters. So let's talk about point 3, including logical and intuitive weaknesses. I can't help but feel that a lot of the support for elemental weaknesses actually stems from this, and I see a lot of people echoing the same idea. How many times have you done a fire giant task and wondered, well, why don't water spells do more damage to fire giants? Doesn't that just make sense? And for me, that answer is basically never. That's because RuneScape isn't about elemental weaknesses. It's not a core part of the game. Instead, it focuses on the combat triangle because you have access to all 3 styles, so you're able to use them, whatever's strong and whatever's weak. Different monsters will be weak to different styles, and that's where the variety comes in. Similarly, when a new World of Warcraft raid comes out and the final boss is a massive fire dragon, I'm not left questioning why one of the top DPS is a fire mage. Elemental weaknesses aren't a part of World of Warcraft. Not every RPG needs to have this kind of philosophy built into it, and old school RuneScape really wasn't built with that in mind. It's different than a game like Pokemon, where elemental advantages and disadvantages are the core game. This is the main gameplay. I think you can imagine just how boring Pokemon would be if there was absolutely none of this. It's also good to know that even in Pokemon, individual Pokemon don't have a weakness. Charmander isn't weak to water because it's Charmander. It's weak to water because it's a fire Pokemon, and fire is weak to water. There's a lot more consistency that's kind of bound across the entire game, and you play by these rules. Okay, but remember when you were a kid and you wanted to go kill, pyre fiends, and you wanted to know why water spells don't do extra damage to them? Isn't that so cute? Shouldn't that just make sense? Unfortunately, I don't think the noob argument really has weight, nor do I take value of what we thought, 2 decades ago. When I first started playing League of Legends, I played Ashe. She's a ranger. And I spent all my gold buying recurve bows. They're bows, so obviously they'd be the best item on a ranger. Why would I buy a sword? She can't use that. If you've played League, you understand that items don't matter. They're just stats that you add to your character. It's a MOBA. The main gameplay is moving your character, not really the gear that you're equipping. I can't apply different rules of a different game and make it make sense in another one. Games rely on a suspension of disbelief. Suspension of disbelief is the avoidance, often described as willing, of critical thinking and logic in understanding something that is unreal or impossible in reality, such as something in a work of speculative fiction, in order to believe it for the sake of enjoying its narrative. Video games kind of rely on this. They can't always make critical sense and abide by real-life logic. They just wouldn't really work. It's a bit silly that General Grardor, who's wearing the Bandos chestplate and the Bandos tassets, only drops it 1 in 381 times. Maybe you're just waiting for the right size that fits you, like you're at a shoe store. Let alone how silly the idea is that General Grardor gets killed and then respawns like a minute later. Maybe that's why the God Wars are taking so damn long, though. I don't know. There's a suspension of disbelief to make the game work as a game. Even if we disregard that for a bit and instead focus on the intuitive weaknesses, I think most people would agree that it makes sense that water does more damage against fire giants. They're covered in fire. Well, what about blue dragons? What is this weak to? I guess dragons breathe fire, so same idea, it would be weak to water. What about mountain trolls? If you're a fan of Tolkien and Dungeons and Dragons, you might know that mountain trolls are weak to fire. This could be seen as rewarding perception and kind of understanding fantasy tropes, but it really starts to fall apart pretty fast when we get to something like worms. Think for a second, what are worms weak to? If you guessed Earth, you're right, but I can't really tell you why. They live underground in a volcano, so surely Earth isn't the worst thing that they encounter. They're dragony, but they're not weak to water, so it's not really like schools of monsters. The intuition falls apart pretty fast when you start expanding the pool of monsters, and instead it's kind of a guess at what the monster is weak to, as if I'm guessing what house each monster would be sorted to at Hogwarts. On the flip side, this intuitive weakness also fails once you start adding in elemental weaknesses. The Trident of the Seas clearly looks like a water-based weapon. It shoots a blue ball. It's a Trident of the Seas. So why does this not benefit from elemental weakness, but Water Blast does? The answer is simply for game balance. I don't think adding elemental weaknesses works if you're only committing to it partially, at least not to create intuitive and logical counters to each other. I can imagine a post like a year later talking about, well, why doesn't the Trident do extra damage against, fire giants? It's a water spell. It's the same thing. Now, flavor isn't always the worst thing ever, and this already exists in the game. The Ice Demon in Chambers of Xeric is weak to fire spells by a lot. If making fire giants and pyrofiends weak to water spells was so important to add a little bit of flavor, they could just do that. I don't think that elemental resistance has to be a brand new stat line that's kind of introduced across the entire game. The last argument I think about this is that instead of being intuitive, this could be a bit of a reward for having the knowledge, similar to somebody who plays Pokemon and knows all the effectiveness without having to, look up a table. While they've updated Monster Exam to let you know what the weakness is, it's important to realize that Monster Examine is on the Lunar Spellbook, not the standard spellbook, which it benefits. So you wouldn't be able to even examine what the monster is unless you swapped to the Lunar Spellbook, examined it, and then went back to the standard spellbook with the correct setup in mind. RuneScape 3 solves this by simply putting the appropriate weak style right on the mob's health. Celestial dragons are weak to ranged, and I don't know how people would feel about this, but it does communicate the information a lot more effectively. Without this, I think the overwhelming majority of mobs is simply going to be an OSRS wiki search as to what spell it's effective and is it even effective to begin with. Remember, you have no way of even knowing if a certain monster is weak to a style, so pretty much every monster you're going to want to search up and see if it actually is weak to something, or maybe you should use a different style. 50% is a pretty massive buff to your damage, so it's not like 10 or 20 stab bonus where you could still do it with melee and you're only giving up just a tad bit of damage. Moving on, I think that there's a case to make magic more appealing for early Slayer and early combat training, and I can't say that this wouldn't be pretty beneficial. This isn't my screenshot, but I spent a lot of time farming blue dragons with Fire Strike to get my early prayer levels up, and with the changes I would just be casting blue Fire Strike for 50% more damage. It's cool, but it's really just because I'm getting more damage and killing things faster. This would be the exact same if the standard spellbook was just increased by 50% damage across the entire board. Magic is already one of the most appealing skills in the early game that a lot of people will train early for things like teleports as well as high level alchemy. So I don't know if making magic just the best combat style in the early game as well, because it is getting a pretty massive buff in the early game. I don't know if that's really like the most important focus, especially when there's other things like range, which is a lot weaker in the early game, and you're doing a lot of really bad Slayer tasks with like the Dorgashan crossbow or just AFKing at Ammonite crabs. And I think the level 1 to 50 progression of ranged could be a more interesting slot here for early Slayer. Imagine what a 50% buff to the Dorgashan crossbow would be. I think that would really change people's opinion of early range training. Another welcome change I've seen is no more over reliance on Fire Strike. Early Ironmen and even mains really will often get to level 13 magic and then they're casting Fire Strike basically until they're done using the standard spellbook and have something like Ivan's Blast. My issue here is that I don't think that this has really been fixed, and if anything, I believe it's been made worse. Instead of hitting level 13 and getting Fire Strike, now you're just hitting level 5 and you have Water Strike instead. It scales up to the same damage as Fire Strike, and really the only benefit of going up to Earth Strike and Fire Strike is a tad bit more experience. So just find a mob that's weak to water, and from level 5 onwards, you're casting Water Strike. I think there could be a case where Water Bolt is very appealing because it does a lot more damage versus a certain water mob, such as blue dragons, but typically people already stay at strikes simply because mind runes are so much cheaper than chaos runes or death runes, and that's going to be a lot more restrictive in your early game. I specify early Slayer because I think that once you get to the mid to late game of Slayer and training combat, most of your magic training is done with ancient spells. Bursting and barraging Slayer tasks is simply way too efficient for both Slayer as well as combat training. And there's already so many good ancient magics tasks that I don't think you really need more magic-based Slayer tasks to do. It might be an option, and that's great, but I think you would still rather train, your other skills instead. So I don't really see this making massive changes when you're already, maxing magic a lot faster than some of the other skills. Which brings me to the fifth point: encourage bringing specialized weapons and styles. When I talked about different monsters having arbitrary elemental weaknesses, you may have rightfully pointed out that for melee, it's also kind of arbitrary. There's no real reason why a lot of the monsters are weak to stab or slash or crush. And aren't these elemental weaknesses just the magic version of all of the melee combat styles? Unfortunately, I don't think that this comparison really holds up, and I'll try to demonstrate it. First off, let's just imagine that we just tried to release melee weaknesses like stab, slash, and crush. Imagine if the rune scimitar, the rune sword, and the rune mace were identical weapons. They had the exact same stats. Scimitar was just a slash version, sword was just a stab, and mace was just the crush version. Just this system, which sounds pretty boring to me, would already be far more engaging than what the elemental weaknesses currently have. You have 3 different weapons to acquire for 3 different scenarios. There's actually a goal in mind, and how you acquire these can be a little bit different. Furthermore, while these weapons definitely have their use cases, it's not as defining as I think the magic spells are, with a 50% bonus. Sure, the sword is going to be better against green dragons because dragons are weak to stab, but you can still kill one with a rune scimitar. It's not like the rune sword is getting a 50% accuracy and a 50% damage bonus. Same thing with the mace. As it exists right now, it does do a little bit less DPS than the other two, but it at least has a prayer bonus. There's something to, stand it apart. With magic, there is nothing like this. We don't have a fire weapon. I mean, we do have a staff of fire, but it doesn't actually do anything to bring up fire spells. The only thing that the staff really does is provide runes for free. And ultimately, this is a very trivial cost to using these spells, but you could still use the Staff of Fire to cast an earth spell or a water spell. It wouldn't really change anything. You're not really bringing a different weapon to the job. You're just clicking a different spell in the interface because that's the right color. So I don't think that the comparison to stab, slash, and crush actually holds up. And I think the more proper comparison is to compare it to something like accurate, aggressive, controlled, and defensive. Different options that you can click in the interface that the weapon is capable of doing. I think you can almost imagine an elemental staff and it has, 4 elements that you click and it just casts that, right? Even that system would be more interesting than what we have with magic, because at least melee weapons do have some limitations as to what weapon style they can do. I don't think there's any weapon that can do all 4: accurate, aggressive, controlled, and defensive. And even some of the best weapons in the game, such as the Abyssal Whip, they don't have access to aggressive, which is typically used for the extra strength bonus, as well as to train your strength. So even if we didn't have any attack types and we just had weapon styles, these weapons would still be far more interesting than what we have with magic. There's a trade-off. You're using the whip, but you can't get the most max strength experience as you could with an Abyssal Dagger or a bludgeon. This boils down the elemental weaknesses to something more akin to Barbarian Assault. You are being told what style to use against the mob. I'm very positive about the range changes because I do think this encourages bringing along different weapons. However, if the same mentality was applied to range and instead of, different styles, you just had blunt arrows, field arrows, barbed arrows, and bullet arrows, which were made with different color feathers or something like that, and then monsters just took bonus damage to one of the color feathers, I think you can start to see why I have a bit of hesitation and I'm not particularly excited about this change. It's mostly a cosmetic thing to me. I say that I'm not excited about this right now because, there is another point. It is to open up the reward space. I think this is the most interesting point and definitely the one that I could see change my mind the most. New items can come out that really will create a bit more variety and a different style than just, this is the green fire blast, this is the blue fire blast, etc. However, I can't judge this update based on a perfect hypothetical world that I imagine it to be. I can only give my feedback as to what it would be implemented right now, and how I think that there's other ways of opening up the reward space that isn't just massive debuffs to certain monsters. I think we've already seen this with something like Soul Heredit in the Colosseum, where they basically just said, okay, this guy's going to be super, super weak to slash and incredibly tanky to everything else. Congratulations, we buffed the Scythe and gave it another use case. It's not the most interesting way, I think, to make weapons stronger. If there are some really fantastic items kind of looming, I think they probably should have led with that to see what the system would like with these items, and then the weakness system could be a justification for that, rather than the other way around, creating the system first and then, coming out with items later down the line. If you remember, I said that every single mage weapon can cast every single spell, which is why it's not a fair comparison to stab, slash, and crush. Well, this isn't actually entirely true. The Ancient Staff can only cast from the standard spellbook and the ancient spellbook. It can't use the Arceus spellbook. The Staff of the Dead can only cast standard and Arceus. It can't cast ancient spells. So in my opinion, this is actually something to experiment with. If they're going to make some monsters weak to the standard spellbook, why not just make new staffs that limit you to a specific spellbook and really buff the damage there? This will make it competitive with some of the other options, some of the powered staves, and still give that variety without just, saying that this monster is weak to standard and this monster is weak to Arceus. I'm a bit surprised that Ivan's Staff wasn't played around with more as a potential option to this. With the 50% bonus, Fire Blast only does like 1 less damage than Ivan's Blast, and if you include the Tome of Fire, it just beats Ivan Blast entirely. Why not rework Ivan's Blast to be a staff that gives you more damage for casting fire spells? It already forces you to use the standard spellbook, and it basically functions like Fire Blast anyways. Instead of just making monsters weaker, this could be an actual item in your progression that will buff the standard spellbook and make it a little bit better. I could see a upgraded version of this that uses some kind of new item that makes Fire Surge a pretty competitive spell. If you don't like the fire dynamic, why not add a similar version of this that makes water spells pretty good? This would still require you to use the standard spellbook. It would just put more focus on the items instead of the spells themselves. The same thing can be applied to the Slayer Staff. Making this item a lot more effective when you're casting Crumble Undead or Magic Dart would be a lot more interesting to me than just adding the elemental bonuses. If they don't want to add like an upgraded Crumble Undead or make it scale with your level, just add a new upgraded Slayer Staff that like dramatically increases the damage of Crumble Undead. The new Blue Moon Spear from Perilous Moons could have been a really cool way to, make water spells or even single target ice spells like a lot more powerful. It's something to strive for to make your items better. Even aside from standard spellbooks, what about the grass spells in the Arceus spellbook? These are hardly ever used. Why not include weapons that buff your grass spells? Maybe they won't do as much damage as, the standard spells, but with the addition of Thralls, they'll beat it out just a bit. This gives you a reason to use Thralls as well as the grass spells themselves. I think a lot of people would look really negatively if there were monsters that were weak to grass spells, but I don't really see a difference between that and being weak to fire, again, outside of just like a flavor change. If that's justifiable for you and you don't like that, there already are spells like the Demon Bane spells, and I feel like these hardly ever get used. A magical Arclight that allows you to cast these Demon Bane spells and do some really crazy damage would be a really cool way of making these spells more relevant, and it would actually, feel more organic because they're already supposed to be the best at killing demons. The same is already done with things like the Dragon Hunter Lance or the Dragon Crossbow, and I think a Dragon Staff here would work just as well. If water spells are just so damn important for dragons, just make the Dragon Staff only able to use water spells in the standard spellbook or something. It wouldn't be fair for me to criticize a lack of items introduced without talking about the Tome of Fire and the Tome of Water. Essentially, they're just adding the 50% damage from the Tome of Fire to every single standard spell when you have the right weakness. And then these are just a bonus 10% damage when you're using the appropriate element. Basically, you're still never really going to use these unless the element calls for it, which I think is fine as a baseline, but there should be a lot more items like this that should have been proposed to actually like round out, the update. I think you can imagine how boring it would be if the only things to benefit Stab, Slash, and Crush was like a defender. There was like a Crush defender, a Stab defender, and a Slash defender. The 20% accuracy also makes water spells just better than fire spells now that they do the same damage. So really, you're just going to be looking for stuff that's weak to water now. And I also want to say that making these come from skilling bosses, Wintertodd and Temperos, is a pretty shaky start to this entire, elemental system. I think I'd care a lot more about these items if they came from actual combat sources or actual bosses, not skilling bosses. Again, imagine if defenders came from Guardians of the Rift. It would be a little bit weird. The changes to the Tome of Fire and Water are also not reflected in PvP. I believe they are being unchanged in PvP, which causes another issue where, once again, PvP has different rules from the main game. And again, it's why I really wonder if they wanted to just buff the standard spellbook completely, and they chose not to because of PvP, basically. I know it's difficult to balance items for 2 different modes, but I really do hate every time there's different rules and items don't function the same way as they would. It almost feels like 2 separate games that I'm playing, and I just never really enjoy that my knowledge doesn't really transfer over like that. Finally, on the subject of reward space, I did want to talk about some of the best in slot mage gear that currently exists. So with all of this gear, full ancestral, Harmonious Staff, and an Eladina Sword, I'm getting up to 45% magic bonus. This is a little shocking to me considering that this full gear only gives 45%, yet clicking the correct color is a 50% bonus. When looking at this, I think you can empathize why I'm not entirely sold on just elemental buffs being the way of increasing damage. In my opinion, the magic skill and progression is far more constrained by just how limited they're allowed to really pump numbers. The percentage system is different than the range strength or the melee system, so you don't get as much incremental progress. And you can't really expand the percentage without fundamentally changing how the shadow works, which also acts as sort of a constraint among any kind of progress with the skill. I really do think that a lot more progress could be made with the mage skill if they instead focused on redesigning the formula and how damage is calculated with magic instead of just buffing some skills against certain monsters. It feels like a bandage solution, not actually addressing the core issue that I would prefer to see more changes to. Also, shout out to the Harmonized Orb. This thing has absolutely shot up from 400 mil to 500 mil because of the changes that they listed. That's one way to make nightmare items more valuable, I guess. I don't mean to sound negative about updates. I'm generally a very big fan of them, and I really do like the range changes. I have some criticisms of that as well, but they're pretty reserved, and in general, I think it's a good and positive change. For me, though, Project Rebalance should be tweaking some things, adding a couple numbers here and there, not creating a game that is based around elemental weaknesses. The last thing I'd like to leave off with is 2 scenarios. So far, only about 30 mobs or so have been proposed with elemental weaknesses, and I don't know entirely if this is the entire list that they're going with, or they plan on slowly iterating more and more into that pool. And honestly, I can't really tell you which one I would prefer. The entire magic system being about elemental weaknesses doesn't really seem that appealing to me, but neither does an undercooked system where just a couple of select mobs are getting bonus damage. I'm probably going to have to think about that a little bit more. I hope this video helped outline some of my criticism and give a little bit of justification for it. If you disagree and you like all these changes, that's perfectly fine. By all means, you're entitled to enjoy it. Again, this isn't the death of RuneScape. I don't plan on quitting because of it. It's just not something I'm particularly excited about, and I would hope to see some other sweeping changes to Magic instead of just focusing on these weaknesses. Thank you guys so much for watching. I know I run a bit long with these videos, but I think it's good to give my thoughts out in a somewhat organized fashion. I'm really excited about some of the other changes with ranged and a bit of minor tweaks to, the melee bonuses as well. And I guess I'll see what's coming up next. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.